Thousands of voices cry out in pain and confusion. As the sound grows closer, you finally see them, an army, 15,000 men, but they aren't marching. They're staggering forward, shuffling in a horrifying procession of human misery. 99 out of every 100 men is completely blind, their eye sockets empty and crusted with dried blood. Each group is led by a single man left with one eye, forced to see the nightmare he's guiding back home. This is psychological warfare at its most refined. This is revenge turned into spectacle. This is what happens when two emperors hate each other so deeply that the battlefield itself becomes a stage for their personal feud. And here's the most chilling part. When this broken army finally reached its king, the sight was so devastating that it killed him. He looked upon what had been done to his soldiers and died of shock 2 days later. So, how did it come to this? What kind of hatred runs so deep that blinding 15,000 men feels like justice? Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing acts of calculated cruelty in human history. The story of Basil the Bulgar slayer and the revenge that helped bring an empire to its knees. To understand this level of organized horror, you first need to understand the world that produced it. We're in the early 11th century, right at the edge of what we call the medieval era. The Byzantine Empire, what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire, saw itself as Rome's true continuation. To them, they weren't a medieval kingdom at all. They were the Roman Empire, chosen by God, the final stronghold of real civilization. Constantinople, their capital, was the richest and most advanced city in the Christian world. While Western Europe was still divided and relatively rough around the edges, the Byzantines had Greek fire, advanced engineering, a professional standing army, and a bureaucratic system that would impress even modern governments. They had libraries, universities, and a level of culture the West wouldn't match for centuries. But empires have a problem. They're never satisfied, and during this period, Byzantium faced a serious threat. Bulgaria? The First Bulgarian Empire hadn't just resisted Byzantine expansion. It had been steadily pushing back. Bulgarian lands stretched from the Danube River to the Aegean Sea, from the Adriatic all the way to the Black Sea. This wasn't some barbarian horde. Bulgaria had a functioning state, its own church, and most dangerously of all, something the Byzantines could not tolerate: independence. Inside the Byzantine world, you was a powerful idea known as the oikomene, the civilized Christian world under rightful authority. In Byzantine thinking, there could be only one true emperor, the legitimate heir of Rome. Everyone else was either a subject who didn't realize it yet or a rebel who needed to be brought back into line. And Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria clearly fell into that second category. But this wasn't just theory or politics. This was personal, deeply personal, because this story is really about two men who hated each other with a passion that would fuel 3 decades of war and produce one of history's most horrifying scenes. On one side stood the emperor who would earn one of the coldest nicknames in history, Basil Roman II, Emperor of the Romans. Born in 958 into the Macedonian dynasty, Basil was born in the purple, literally born in the imperial chamber, marking him as legitimate from the moment he entered the world. But his childhood wasn't soft or sheltered. His father died early, and Basil grew up watching regents and generals tear each other apart while he waited to actually rule. When he finally took full control in his 20s, that experience shaped him completely. He became one of the least luxurious emperors imaginable. No grand feasts, no elaborate court rituals unless absolutely required. He wore military gear more often than imperial robes. He never married, never had children, and lived a life that was almost monk-like in its simplicity. Everything revolved around the empire. Chroniclers describe him as medium height, with piercing blue eyes, a thick beard, and a presence that made seasoned generals uneasy. He was patient, calculating, merciless when needed, and he remembered insults the way other men remembered victories. One Byzantine historian wrote that Basil was naturally stern and never forgave a wrong. That detail matters more than you might think. On the other side stood Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria. His early life is less clear, partly because Byzantine writers tried hard to downplay him. But the results speak for themselves. Samuel rose to power in the late 10th century during a time of chaos in Bulgaria. Through sheer determination and military skill, he didn't just stabilize the kingdom, he expanded it. His contemporaries called him unstoppable. Bulgarian sources describe him as a warrior king who led from the front, someone who understood both the big picture of empire and the brutal realities of mountain warfare. He was smart, tough, and most importantly, realistic. Samuel knew he couldn't defeat the Byzantine Empire in a straight, open battle, so he never tried. He used the terrain, relied on ambushes, and made the Byzantines pay for every mile they advanced. To Basil, Samuel represented everything he despised. A man claiming authority over land Basil believed was Roman. A ruler bold enough to defy what Basil saw as God's chosen emperor. And in the summer of 986, Samuel was about to make that hatred personal. The year is 986. Basil Roman II is still young, not yet 30, and full of confidence. He's already crushed internal revolts and proven he can rule. Now he believes it's time to deal with Bulgaria once and for all. He gathers a massive army, possibly around 30,000 men, though medieval numbers are never exact, and marches north. His target is the fortress of Serdica, modern-day Sofia. Capturing it would open a direct path into the heart of Bulgaria. At first, everything goes according to plan. The Byzantines have more troops, better equipment, and experienced professionals. This should be easy, but Samuel has been preparing. After inconclusive fighting around the city, Basil decides to pull back for the winter. It's August, and the decision seems sensible. Regroup, resupply, and return in the spring. But to get home, the army must pass through a narrow mountain corridor known as Trajan's Gate. It's a tight valley where the landscape controls everything and numbers mean nothing. Samuel had been waiting for this moment. He positioned his forces above the pass and allowed the Byzantine army to march straight into the trap. When they were stretched out, exhausted, and unable to maneuver, he struck. Byzantine sources tried to soften what happened next, but the reality is impossible to hide. It was a massacre. Bulgarian forces poured down from the heights and slammed into the Byzantine column. All the training, discipline, and expensive equipment meant nothing in that narrow pass. The soldiers couldn't form proper battle lines. Everything collapsed into panic and confusion. The emperor's elite bodyguard fought desperately to shield him, but the situation spiraled out of control. According to the chroniclers, Basil himself barely escaped alive. He abandoned what was left of his army, mounted a fast horse, and fled back toward Constantinople. The Bulgarians seized the imperial treasury that had been traveling with the army. They captured weapons, armor, and supplies, but more than that, they captured something far more damaging: Basil's pride. For an emperor who believed he ruled by divine will, who saw the Byzantine Empire as God's chosen authority over the Christian world, this wasn't just a battlefield loss. It was humiliation on a spiritual level, and this is where it's important to understand how emperors, especially Byzantine emperors, thought. This wasn't like a modern general losing a battle and calmly planning the next move. To Basil, this defeat was a cosmic offense. Samuel hadn't simply won. He had challenged the natural order of the universe itself, and Basil would dedicate the next 28 years of his life to making Samuel pay for it. After Trajan's Gate, Basil changed. The impulsive young ruler hardened into something colder and far more deliberate. He didn't rush into revenge. Instead, he turned inward. There were rebellious generals who had seen his humiliation and thought he was weak. Basil crushed them one by one with ruthless efficiency, learning patience and the power of long-term planning. But Bulgaria was never far from his thoughts. Beginning in the late 980s and continuing through the 990s, Basil started what would become his life's work: the systematic destruction of the Bulgarian state. This wasn't about heroic, decisive battles. It was about grinding Bulgaria down until nothing remained. Every single year, Basil campaigned in Bulgarian territory. He didn't chase Samuel's main army. Instead, he targeted the foundations of survival. Crops were burned, farmland was ruined, fortresses were captured and torn apart. Then the army would withdraw, only to return the next year and do it all again. It was slow, relentless, and devastatingly effective. The historian John Skylitzes described it plainly. Basil invaded Bulgaria year after year, destroying everything in his path. Imagine what that meant for ordinary people. Every summer brought rumors that the Byzantine army was coming. Families abandoned fields, hid food, and prayed their local fortress would hold. Even if your village was spared, you knew someone else's harvest had been burned, which meant hunger for everyone when winter came. Samuel fought back fiercely. He remained a brilliant defensive commander and made Basil bleed for every advance. Records describe battles where Bulgarian forces inflicted serious losses on the Byzantines. In 998, Samuel even pushed deep into Byzantine territory, reaching as far as Thessaloniki. But the math was unforgiving. Byzantium had more men, more money, and deeper reserves. Bulgaria did not. By the early 1000s, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Fortresses that had resisted for years were falling. Bulgarian nobles, seeing where things were headed, began defecting to the Byzantine side. The empire was being slowly strangled. Samuel was now an old man, likely in his 60s, an advanced age for the time. He had spent his entire life building and defending Bulgaria, only to watch it collapse piece by piece. And desperate men can be very dangerous. In 1014, as Basil prepared yet another campaign, Samuel decided he had to make his stand. He couldn't win a war of attrition. He couldn't outlast Byzantium, but maybe he could force one decisive battle that would finally break Basil's resolve. He chose a mountain valley known as Cladian Pass. It was July 1014, and Basil was marching deep into Bulgarian territory with a large army. Samuel knew this might be his final chance. The pass, whose name means the key in Greek, was a narrow gorge between the Belasica and Ograzdan mountains, a place where geography dictated everything. Samuel ordered his engineers to build a massive fortification across the valley, a wall of earth and timber that completely blocked the route. Behind it, he stationed the best troops Bulgaria had left, perhaps 12 to 15,000 men. The plan was simple. Basil couldn't realistically go around the mountains. He would have to come through the pass, and there the Bulgarians would destroy him. When Basil arrived and saw the fortifications, he must have felt a bitter sense of familiarity. This was the same kind of trap Samuel had used decades earlier at Trajan's Gate. But Basil was no longer that man. Now in his mid-50s, hardened by nearly 30 years of war, he ordered direct assaults anyway. For days, possibly up to a week, Byzantine troops attacked the wall head-on and were thrown back again and again with heavy losses. The Bulgarians fought with the desperation of men who knew this was their last stand. Arrows, javelins, and rocks rained down. Boiling liquids were poured on attackers. Byzantine bodies piled up in front of the wall. Some of Basil's generals urged him to abandon the attack, but Basil had another plan. He had been consulting with one of his most trusted commanders, Nikephoros Xiphias. Xiphias proposed a daring idea. Instead of going through the pass, what if they went over the mountains? The Belasica range was brutal terrain, steep, wild, and without proper trails. The march would be exhausting and dangerous, and if Samuel discovered it, the detachment could be wiped out. But if it worked, it would change everything. Basil agreed. Xiphias led a force of several thousand men into the wilderness. For days, they climbed through forests and narrow paths, carrying full gear, moving quietly, knowing discovery meant death. Meanwhile, the main Byzantine army continued attacking the wall, keeping Bulgarian attention focused forward. Then, on the morning of July 29, 1014, everything fell into place. The Bulgarians held their positions, exhausted but confident. Another Byzantine assault was underway, and then, from behind their lines, came a sound that must have frozen every man in place. Byzantine war cries. Xiphias had made it over the mountains. The shock was instant and overwhelming. Bulgarian soldiers suddenly faced enemies emerging from what was supposed to be safety. from the direction of their own camp. According to Skylitzes, the defense collapsed almost immediately. Men fled their positions in panic, but the wall they had built to trap the Byzantines now trapped them instead. They were caught between Xiphias behind them and Basil's main army in front. The battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse. Samuel barely escaped. Sources say his son Gabriel fought off attackers and carried him away on horseback. Behind them, the Bulgarian army was destroyed. The battle became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. Thousands were killed, and thousands more, Byzantine sources claim as many as 15,000, were captured alive. They were disarmed, stripped of armor, and herded together under guard. The battle was over. Basil had won completely, but for the prisoners, the worst was still to come, because as Emperor Basil Roman II stood on that battlefield, his mind wasn't on victory celebrations. He was thinking about Trajan's gate. He was thinking about 28 years of humiliation, and he was about to send a message that would echo across history. What followed was one of the most deliberate and calculated acts of cruelty ever recorded in warfare. Basil had options. He could have ransomed the prisoners, which was common practice, and would have poured money into the Byzantine treasury. He could have executed them, brutal but quick, and entirely normal by medieval standards. He could have enslaved them, forced them into his own army, or kept them as hostages. But he chose none of those paths. Instead, Basil issued an order so extreme that it must have stunned everyone who heard it. The historian John Skylitzes records what happened next, and the details are horrifying. The prisoners, reportedly around 15,000 men, though the exact number is debated, were divided into groups of 100. Then Byzantine soldiers began systematically blinding 9 men in each group, and it's important to understand what blinding meant in this era. This wasn't a medical procedure. We don't know the precise methods, but they likely involved heated irons or sharp blades driven into the eyes. Some sources mention daggers piercing the eyeballs. Others suggest cauterization. Whatever the method, the pain was unimaginable, the damage permanent. These men would never see again. They would spend the rest of their lives dependent on others, unable to fight, unable to work most trades, permanently marked by what had been done to them. But the most disturbing detail comes next. The 100th man in each group was spared total blindness. He was left with one eye, one single eye, not out of mercy, but for a purpose. Someone had to lead the blind men home. Basil ensured that his message would be delivered in the most vivid and horrifying way possible. These one-eyed men were ordered to guide their sightless comrades back to Tsar Samuel. Modern historians debate the numbers. 15,000 may be exaggerated, and the perfect ratio of 99 blind to 1 one-eyed man is suspiciously neat, exactly the kind of symbolism medieval chroniclers loved. But while the figures may be inflated, there is no serious doubt about the core event. A mass blinding did occur on a scale that was unprecedented at the time. Think about the logistics of this. This wasn't an act carried out in the chaos of battle. It took time, probably days. Orders were issued. Prisoners were organized, processed group by group. Soldiers had to carry it out. And through all of it came the screams, the begging, and the growing realization among the prisoners of what awaited them. Men at the back of the line watched as those ahead were mutilated, knowing their turn was coming. And what about the Byzantine soldiers themselves? Some may have seen it as simply following orders. Others may have taken out years of anger on enemies they'd fought for decades. But it's hard not to wonder if any of them hesitated, if any looked at the swelling mass of blinded men and questioned what they were doing. And Basil still wasn't finished. Once the blinding was complete, he gave these men, this ruined army, one final command. Go home, tell your king what happened. Show him what the Byzantine Empire does to those who resist. And so began one of the most horrifying marches in human history. Thousands of men stumbling in total darkness. Faces smeared with dried blood and fluid from destroyed eyes. Many were likely already developing infections. This was medieval warfare. Nothing was clean. Eye wounds especially were prone to turning septic. Some men almost certainly died along the way. The pain would have been constant and overwhelming. Each group of 99 blind men was led by a single half-blind guide, a man who could see just enough to fully comprehend the nightmare he was leading. How long did the march take? We don't know, but likely weeks. The distance to Samuel's location was significant, and these men could barely move. They had to beg for food as they went. Villagers along the route must have watched in stunned horror as this endless column passed by. Word would have spread ahead of them. The army is coming back, but you won't believe what's been done to them. When the procession finally reached Tsar Samuel's camp in late summer of 1014, the old king was waiting for news. He knew a battle had been fought. He did not know the scale of the disaster. According to every source we have, the sight broke him. Skylitzes writes that Samuel collapsed and fainted the moment he saw his soldiers. Picture that moment, an elderly ruler who had spent his entire life building and defending an empire, now standing before thousands of living reminders of its destruction. Soldiers turned into walking corpses. Permanent monuments to defeat. Samuel never recovered. 2 days later, on October 6, 1014, he was dead. Whether it was a stroke, a heart attack, or sheer shock, the result was the same. Basil's psychological weapon had struck harder than any blade. He hadn't just destroyed an army, his calculated cruelty had quite literally killed an enemy king, and it earned him a name that history would never forget: Basil the Bulgar Slayer. Samuel's death marked the beginning of the end. Within 4 years, by 1018, Bulgaria was fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. The state that had humiliated Basil 3 decades earlier was wiped from the map. The blinding of the Bulgarian army remains one of the most chilling examples of psychological warfare ever recorded. In the Byzantine world, blinding was already a political tool, often used against rivals to the throne, since a physically imperfect man could not rule. But Basil took that idea and scaled it into an instrument of mass terror. What he demonstrated was that Byzantine power wasn't just military. It was psychological. The empire could impose fates worse than death. It could break not only armies, but entire peoples. The blinded soldiers became living warnings, proof of what happened to those who resisted imperial authority. So here's the question: was Basil Roman, too, a monstrous tyrant whose cruelty knew no limits? Or was he a cold, brilliant strategist who understood that terror could end wars faster than swords? The blinding effectively ended a conflict that had dragged on for decades. In Basil's mind, perhaps thousands of blinded men were preferable to generations more of bloodshed. But for the men who lived the rest of their lives in darkness, that calculation likely felt very different. They were the human cost of imperial ambition, a message written not in ink, but in suffering. This is what happens when personal vendetta collides with military power and political calculation. A reminder that the most effective weapons aren't always the ones that kill the body, but the ones designed to break the human spirit. So what do you think? An unforgivable atrocity or a brutal but effective end to a long war? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this deep dive compelling, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories exploring the darker corners of history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.